What if your child is born with what is generally regarded as a disability and they don't fit within the norms that society is comfortable with? How do you raise your child? My guest today is Candida di Giandomenico. Candida, thank you so much for agreeing to share your story with us, and welcome here.
Thank you.
So please tell us the story of your daughter that was born and how you raised her.
Sure. So Takara was born actually 2 days before the first free and fair elections in South Africa. She was born in April, which I suppose now would be 30 years ago. And at the time she was born, I was 23, which is fairly young for somebody to be born with a child, with a disability, particularly, with what she had. And to all intents and purposes, the pregnancy was fairly normal. I went into labor a little bit earlier than expected. And as soon as she was born, because it was a bit early, they whisked her off, popped her into an incubator for a few hours. And then a while later, they brought her back. A few hours later, they brought her back. And I remember as they handed her to me, I looked at her and I said to my mom, she doesn't look right. She doesn't look normal. And my mom was, no, what do you mean? And I said, Mom, back then, I didn't realize that using the word mongoloid was not was not I suppose was not the correct word to use. Anyhow, that was my comment. She looks as if she's mongoloid. And my mom said, no, they all have these slanted eyes when they're born. It's from going through the birth canal. But the day after, I heard the pediatrician speak, and they were going to send for chromosome tests. And I then knew that, she had Down syndrome. I mean, we didn't really need the chromosome test. It was quite obvious that she had Down syndrome. And so the beginning of this journey of raising a person with an extra 23rd chromosome began. Yeah.
Wow. Can I take a moment and just ask you, you mentioned that you were 23 and that was pretty young to be a mother with such a huge responsibility. What is the impact at that point, in that moment when you realize this is the reality of the situation?
I suppose it's different for different people, but the way I experienced it also, given that it was 30 years ago, these days you can go onto TikTok and Instagram and there's lots of people with Down syndrome. It's a lot more, I guess, it's more acceptable, and people with disability are a lot more, we notice them more, they are given a lot more opportunity. But back then it was not the easiest thing. I still don't think it would be easy, even if it was to happen to me now at this age, 30 years later. And the way I experienced it was almost like a death. And I remember I'd had all these visions of, you walk down the road with your baby and you do all these baby things. And we bought clothes and people had gifted us things. And I thought to myself, like, what am I going to do with all of this stuff that we've been given? It was crazy. It was such an illogical thing to think. But I suppose in my mind, what I planned as being this child, this was not what I'd signed up for. This was something so completely different. And you don't quite know what to expect. There isn't a class you can go to at school that says, here's what to do when your child is born with a disability, or when your child is born with a problem. You're not really equipped. At 23, I'm not sure many of us are that equipped for parenthood. But let alone parenthood of a person with a disability. So for me, it literally was like a death. And I remember quite a lot of shame, sort of feeling maybe somehow I had done something, maybe I was young, so maybe I'd gone to a club and I'd had a drink and I didn't know I was pregnant, and this drink had, caused this. Maybe I don't know, taken a tablet for a headache and somehow I'd created this thing. So it was for me, it was a very bleak time. I think because there's the death of what you perceive your life to look like, and
What
then
your
venturing into
expectation
an
was.
unknown.
Mm,
Mm. So it's
mm,
venturing into an unknown that you, you have no concept of it. I didn't know anyone who had a Down syndrome baby. We had a friend growing up whose son was quite a lot older, an Italian friend of my father's who had a Down syndrome boy. But no one in my family had a child with a disability. So you really do venture into a world of that you don't know and you don't really
mm.
have any sort of concept of. So I think that's
Mm.
often the scariest part. You can't
Yeah,
really
it
phone up
must
a
be.
friend and go like, how do I do this?
Yes,
Yeah.
someone to ask for advice or something. It's a whole new world that you have to discover as you go along. Hey, it must be quite frightening.
Yeah, it is. It is. And for me,
Mm,
it was quite bleak. Look, I am the sort of person who bounces back quite quickly. I have a family that's very loving, and everybody was just loved her.
mm,
Um, I did, however, have one family member who, at that time, he's passed subsequently, but he was married to one of my aunts, and he made a comment to my mother. She's so young, she should really just put this child in a home and forget about her and continue her life. And that was very triggering for me because it almost, in a way, maybe it was a blessing, and I only realize it now because it was the thing that made me think that is just not an option. I just
mm,
is not an option. This could never happen.
mm.
Um, so we didn't choose to go that route. I know some parents do, and it's everybody's choice, but for us, that was just never going to happen. Yeah.
Sure. What a story. What an incredible story. So tell us, how do you raise a child with Down syndrome? How is the day-to-day care and nurturing? Is it different?
So, I think with Takara, when she was a lot younger, it sort of started off very often the milestones are fairly similar, obviously depending on, how much that additional chromosome has impacted the child.
Mm,
Um, she managed to hit all of her milestones pretty well. What starts to happen then is that the ability for them to reach those milestones tapers off. So an ordinary, I'll say ordinary, child without a disability would, have a trajectory that would continue like this. So
mhm,
they almost start and then it starts to flatten.
mm,
Or get, they're less able to keep up with the milestones of a child that doesn't have a disability. Um, the the difficulty with Takara particularly was when she was about 6 months old. She was doing very, very well. I was taking her to see an occupational therapist, etc. They had a wonderful thing that they ran, like a clinic that they ran on the first Thursday of every month at the Children's Hospital in Parktown. And
mhm,
you could see a pediatrician, you could see a physiotherapist, a speech therapist. So all these therapists were available. And we'd put her on a program called the START program, which was
mhm,
really a brilliant program. And you could run it from home. It was built by therapists to support parents with children with disability. She was doing very well. And then I took her for her inoculations. And she had a very, very adverse reaction to one of the inoculations, which was the whooping cough vaccine.
mhm,
And I've subsequently found that it's not an unusual thing. Sometimes a lot of parents don't link the two, but unfortunately she did, and it created. She got a form of epilepsy called myoclonic seizures or infantile spasms, and they are very dangerous in babies because each time the child has the fit, and it's not like where the body shakes. One would typically think of an epileptic fit as being shaking. She would literally just crunch over like that, and then she would cry. And I watched this and I thought, no, there's definitely something wrong. I took photographs, went to see the pediatrician, and they sent her for tests and discovered she was having these myoclonic seizures. And at the time, I was seeing a really, really amazing pediatrician. He was probably one of the top guys in South Africa. And he said to me, of the 200 plus cases I've dealt with this particular ailment, this form of epilepsy in infants specifically, I've only ever had 2 that have successfully kind of pulled through. So just know that this is a very dangerous thing, and she may not make it.
Oh.
If they make it, often they are affected because as they have the seizure, the brain is robbed of oxygen. So a little portion of the brain dies. So every time they have the seizure, there's this damage. Anyhow, it just so happened that contrary to my my pediatrician and my GP's advice, I went and saw an alternative doctor. I went to see a homeopath who then gave me some medication and stuff to cleanse the body. And after trying so many allopathic, forms of medication, and I do believe in allopathic medicine, I really think it's got a place. In this situation, it was not helping, and we could not stop the seizures. She got really big because she was having cortisone on a regular basis, injections every day. She stopped holding up her head. She stopped sitting. So it kind of went from bleak to, okay, I've got this. I can do this. The Down Syndrome Association, to the inoculation. And then I think it was even bleaker than it had been when I'd given birth to her. Anyhow, fortunately, by whoever's grace, the homeopathic remedies worked. And within a few days of taking them, the seizures actually stopped. And then obviously was the rebuilding and kind of getting her back to where she was. So we took a bit of a detour, which I think is slightly different to, I suppose to what other parents might have experienced. But she bounced back quite quickly, and then began the journey with this very feisty, very strong-willed person that often clashes with her mother. And then, when she was around 8, I was quite traumatized from all of that and decided I didn't want any more children. And then when she was about 8, we decided we would have another child. And it was only after I'd had my second and third child that I began to realize things that I thought were specific to her and she was being naughty, etc., were really just things that children do. So in my very long way of answering your question, I think for the most part, it would be like raising any other child. They need as much love, they need attention, they need boundaries, they need discipline, they need all of those things. And like one of my other children, he needed OT. He had an issue with his eye. It would jump at the end of a line. So, he went for his OT. The other one went for extra reading classes. So yes, often people with Down syndrome will need some of those additional, that additional support. I think where it can get tricky is when you have a person with an intellectual disability and they are struggling with psychiatric issues or psychological issues, that I find can be a little more challenging to deal with. Because sometimes what one perceives as being just part of the disability may well not be. So with Takara, for example, she often struggled with, she would throw temper tantrums and she would be really, really strong-willed about things. She is a very strong-willed young person. We then, in later years, discovered that, she was battling with mood stabilization, which may just have been how she was, or it actually might have been as a result of the myoclonic seizures. We don't know. But then finding a good neurologist who could work with us and work with her despite her intellectual disability. So this neurologist works specifically with people with intellectual disability. She was able to actually see this is not because Takara has Down syndrome. This is because Takara is battling with mood stabilization.
Yes.
And so, we were then able to support her.
Candida, can
So,
I just
mm.
ask if you would be able to and comfortable to explain to us intellectual disability? What is the degree of the intellectual disability of a child with Down syndrome?
So it's amazing, actually, it can vary. Takara is what they were, I suppose, what they would term fairly high functioning. So, you know, for example, back in the day, young women with Down syndrome would often automatically qualify for having a hysterectomy because, you know, the belief was people have some interesting beliefs around people with Down syndrome. They have a very high sex drive, which is really not true at all. I think it's a very broad and generalized statement, which I think just comes from not always understanding. But it can vary. She manages herself quite well. She keeps herself clean. She baths herself. She can read. She can do basic maths. She can do some cooking. She washes dishes. So she's very capable. Some can be very high functioning and even go on and, you know, have jobs, work with children, and do some amazing things. You see many of them even on television performing. So it can vary from being high functioning, I guess, to those that are less able to, for example, speak well, or less able to intellectualize, who might struggle to read. So it's quite a broad, quite a broad spectrum. Generally, I think, if I was really to generalize, I think Down syndrome possibly is not, people with Down syndrome are generally not always as intellectually challenged as some other disabilities may be. So, yeah.
All right. So for Takara, who's able to do a lot of functioning herself and self-care and all of that, how does she fit into the family? How did she adapt, or all of you adapt, when you had other children?
Yeah, so I found when the kids were younger, so the boys are 8 and 9 years younger than she is. In our immediate family with my sons, when they were younger, they actually played quite well together. They would often get up to all sorts of mischief together. And I think in games that require imaginative play and that sort of thing, she's quite creative and imaginative. So they would play school and all sorts of things. As they got older, and so from about the age of 7 or 8, as the boys intellectually started to surpass her abilities, that was where the challenge kicked in, because they were capable of a lot more, and she was still functioning at, let's say, 6 or 7. So she would do things that 6 and 7-year-olds will do. They will take your school books, and they're looking for paper, so they'll help themselves to a school book, you know, not necessarily out of malice, but because they simply needed something to write on. So that was when World War III broke out in our house, and those were quite challenging years. And often, you know, my son, my older son particularly would say, you know, you favor her over us, and she's allowed to get away with all sorts of things, and, you know, we're not. And, you know, to some level, he may have been right. There's always that thing of understanding the difficulty of a person with a disability. I've tried very hard to not do that. And in fact, perhaps in some level, I've possibly even been a little tougher with her, because I've always wanted her to be able to be as independent and capable as she can be. So I've almost felt a little that, you know, being too soft would be a disservice to her. And sometimes I think I'm a little unfairly so, if I was to play it back now, 30 years later, being smarter and wiser. So during the teenage years, it was a little difficult. What it did do for my kids, though, is they've never been embarrassed of her. They've never, when friends have come to visit, they've never wanted to hide her away, or when we've gone to school to pick them up, or we've gone to a school function, they've always introduced her as their sister. And in fact, both of them went to Scouts and have, you know, obviously done extramural activities. but they were often the children in those groups that would stop other kids who were othering children who maybe were, a little slower than the rest or who needed additional
Yes.
support. So that's been quite amazing. And now, of course, as they're all adults, I often on a Saturday afternoon will come home and they're having a gin and tonic, because I was told by Takara, Mom, I'm an adult. I'm allowed to have I'm allowed to have a drink if I want one, which, she's absolutely right. She is. So they are firm friends and they still get up to nonsense. But that period of, sort of 7, 8, well, probably 8, 9, 10 into adolescence, it was really, really not the easiest time I found. Yeah.
Interesting. I'm wondering how much one has to explain to a child that does not have the disability or the siblings to accommodate and to understand the sibling that has a disability or that's facing challenges or find things more difficult to do and more challenging to understand. I'm sure you had to do a lot of explanation and support there to help them to, as they grow up, learn to be compassionate and understanding and patient and tolerant, as they surpass her in their abilities and kind of leave her behind, knowing that they're going to be able to do more and achieve more and that sort of thing. And there's a love and a bond between them because they grew up together that already exists. It's an interesting dynamic, having teach in all families. We have to teach our children to be tolerant to each other and to be understanding of our differences or their differences. And I remember I've got 2 boys. I deliberately taught them to see the differences in each other and see them as strengths and weaknesses, and to have compassion for it and understanding and a love and appreciation and even admiration for the things that they are, better at than the others. So it's interesting. How did you manage that with your sons?
Yeah, I think when they're younger, I certainly found it, more of a challenge and more difficult because I don't think they're able to intellectualize that there is a limit. So in them, and even as a parent, I mean, I think I was possibly even a little bit the same. Things where I thought she was being naughty were actually her realization that she couldn't do something, and then not being able to act appropriately, she would play out. I've realized it now, but it's taken me a long time. And I was not an 8 or 9-year-old child trying to figure that out.
Yes.
So even as an adult, it was a learning for me. So I think for them, trying to intellectualize it when they were younger, I'm not sure they fully grasped, that they fully grasped it. And they saw it as us possibly making excuses or her being manipulative or being naughty. Look, having said that, she can be a real chance taker. So we all go to gym together, and often she and I train together. We have a trainer that trains us. She's a little overweight, and even he will say, I can see this one, she's taking chances. So there is a part of that that's true. Like all of us, we have our capacity for manipulation and taking chances, etc. But I think that with the continuous explaining, it's like trying to get them to clean their rooms. They don't always do it. They don't do it until they hit a certain age where they don't bath. My boys went through a phase of not wanting to bath. But as they got older, with the continuous reinforcement, I don't need to tell them to go and bath. They will bath themselves. They know that they need to clean their rooms. So as adults, they've embraced those things.
Yes.
So I think it's a consistent reminder and a consistent, telling people and explaining to them, this is what Down syndrome is. This is what it does to people. This is, why she battles with it. What I have noticed happening is as they got older and started hitting, 18, 17, even 16, is they would come to me and say, Mom, you shouted at Takara because of this. But you know what? I actually don't think she really knows how to do this. And what I've noticed is if I tell her slowly and I tell her twice, she actually can do it. So I think you're telling her too fast and you're saying it, you know, in a rough way. So it confuses her.
Isn't that
So
beautiful? So they've also learned how to help her, support
yeah,
her.
yeah, absolutely.
Beautiful.
And very often they'll go and take her for a cup of, cup of coffee. They'll go for cake and coffee together, or they'll take her to a movie on their own. So it's interesting how they've sort of stepped in as, they've really got a very good relationship. It's just, I think it's just not letting up on reminding them and bearing in mind, where they are. It's this balancing act the whole time and consistently checking, am I actually being unfair? Is what these boys or this boy is saying about the unfairness, is there an element of truth in that? Or is this, a young person trying to make sense of something that he can't really conceptualize because he's still young and he's still growing, So that balance, I guess that's the gift of having children. They force us to look at ourselves.
It's a huge learning curve that I think never ends, eh?
Yeah, absolutely. I
Wow.
think where it gets quite where I often find it quite challenging and a little sad in a way is that I found that with children with disability, well, not that she's a child anymore, but certainly as a child growing up, we would have things like, we would have a sleepover. It's more tricky with people who have children with disability because very often you don't want your child to go to someone else's home. They've got their own idiosyncrasies, like all of us do, and sometimes it's just a little more pronounced in people with intellectual disability. Sometimes the way that they phrase things, the parents understand or the caregiver understands, but people in that house might not. So it's not always the easiest thing to have these sleepovers. But she did have sleepovers. She had a 21st birthday. She had all of those sorts of things. But so for example, when my son had his first girlfriend, she would love to have a boyfriend. It just sort of, it has, not that I would stop her having a boyfriend. It just hasn't happened. It hasn't materialized. And my child has a preference for very handsome boys. So she likes the Justin Bieber look.
Okay.
She likes the Harry Styles look. And of course, the sadness there is that the Harry Styles and the Justin Biebers of this world, are not necessarily going to select a young lady with Down syndrome who is my daughter. So I know that for her, she would absolutely love that. And she has spoken about things like, being able to drive and the things that I think a lot of people, want to be able to do. You want to be independent. You want to be able to drive and potentially get married one day or have a child. Or, I think a lot of people want that. And it's not that I think she can't have it and I would stop her from having it. It's just that there are the realities of her situation. So that sometimes does make me feel, I do feel a little heart sore because the boys are going to university. They are about to embark on careers. And that's not her reality. She's intelligent enough to realize that that's not her world, and it doesn't necessarily stop her from speaking about it or expressing that sort of thing. So that's, I think, where as adults it gets a little more challenging. So there's that.
That makes me sad also just to hear you talk about that, because we all have dreams and ideals and goals and things, and it's as everybody would have, regardless of what their intellectual ability is, they have them. How do you have conversations with your daughter about this? Do you and I'm careful because I don't want to sound disrespectful, but how do you help her understand her reality in contrast with her dreams and ideals. It must be very difficult.
Yeah. So yeah, I think one of the gifts of that my daughter has is she is so happy with small things. Whether it's driving to the garage and saying to her, hey, would you like to get a cold drink? Which we don't often do. It's a bit of a treat, you know, like, should we get a cold drink? That she's now in her, she's in her element. She doesn't need massive things to find joy and happiness. It's actually, I think it's something we could all learn from. So I've generally tried to, you know, go that route with her because I know it's a way in. You know, so of painting a positive picture around, like, so one of these days when these boys are big and they've moved out, you're going to have a lovely big room. We'll have the lounge to ourselves. So I try and sort of paint, you know, that picture. And my husband, you know, my husband will often say, no, you're my girl. You're not going anywhere. You know, we're going to, you know, you and I are going to do X, Y, and Z. So, and that always gets her, you know, quite excited because she's had a very, very good relationship with my husband. I have, when it's come to the discussion around babies, said to her, gosh, do you remember when the boys were little? Do you remember they, you know, the smelly nappies and they wake you up in the middle of the night? I mean, it's a lot of work, you know. Is that something that you think you'd want to do? And then she's like, oh, no, I don't want to I don't want to change a nappy. So we've had those types of conversations. And interestingly, as she's getting older, at one point she was quite keen on this idea of being able to sort of, you know, stay on her own, etc. Whereas now the idea of going on her own is definitely not something she's so keen on anymore. You know, even living away from home. So for example, going to a facility, you know, she's not keen on that anymore. So, you know, she is aware that she has, you know, that she has the extra chromosome. She is aware that she has Down syndrome. How much of it she fully grasps, I'm not totally sure. I can't say, but she is aware that she does have, you know, that she does have Down syndrome. We've tried as much as possible, I guess, with our children to always be honest with them. You know, whether it's an education about sex or it's an education about living on your own or the realities of having babies. So we've tried to do that, but not in a way, I guess, that's too scary, but rather focusing on, you know, home is great. We've got this, we've got that. You know, there's food, you can help cook as opposed to having to do it yourself. And we are very blessed because she goes to a wonderful facility where she goes during the day. She and they do all sorts of things. They maintain, you know, their life skills. So she still does writing and reading and maths, and they do lots of art and cooking. They have I'm not going to say story time, not story time, but they have sort of a debrief every morning where everyone sits in a circle and speaks about how they're feeling. And in fact, if she's been really, really misbehaving, just the threat of saying, look, if it continues, you're not going to Hotnet House today, that is often enough to get her back on the straight and narrow, because she's definitely not wanting to miss out on what they do. So they you know, they really do have a lot of fun, and she loves that. So I think that's also made her feel better. When she was in more of I want to say like a workshop facility, it was awful for her. So we tried a few different places, and I think many people with adults, kids with disabilities battle with this. What do you do after school? School is great, and when they're little, everyone's, oh, they're so cute, they're so sweet. As they get older, you know, they're not so cute anymore, and they're now adults with real issues. You know, at one point she was at a specific place where they were putting nuts and bolts into plastic packets all day, and if they didn't have spoons to put in plastic packets, they really didn't do much else. And she was quite miserable during that time. But having found somewhere where she's being stimulated, she is enjoying life. They go and do events. They're part of Special Olympics, so they do sports twice a week or different sports activities. You know, doing things in groups, baking. You know, I think that's really, really made a difference to her quality of life. Because it's not a quality of life to sit packing things. I mean, nobody wants us to pack plastic spoons. With all due respect to facilities that do it, I think it's better than nothing. And I think there's a huge amount of work that's required, you know, all over the world, actually, to look at, so what happens to people with intellectual disability when they finish school? Where do they go?
That's very true. And I find I've also had some interactions with some institutions. Some are definitely far better than others. But this sounds great for her. It sounds like she has some social interaction with other people and creative and stimulating activities and a variety of things to do. So there's something to look forward to every day. And,
yeah, it's purpose. She has a purpose when she
I was
gets
just about to
yeah.
say the same thing.
Yeah.
That's her, for her, as much as she's going to find purpose and to pursue in her life.
Yeah.
That sounds wonderful.
There is something though that is more challenging, and I think that's you know, she still will do things often that young kids will do. And that does become tiring. Like, you know, we've got to keep repeating certain things. You know, so something she's very, very good at, very diligent. Other things, you know, just are really, really challenging. For some people with Down syndrome as well, there's a term for it. I can't quite recall what it is. So, for example, they may need to like rub something or touch something or tap something all the time. So she has this consistent thing where she's got to be rolling something in her fingers. We've tried everything. We've tried stress balls. We've tried rope. We've tried elastic bands. People have come with all kinds of ideas. And at one point she was doing it with toilet paper. She was stealing toilet paper and making tiny little balls. So they were all over the house, these balls. And eventually we've got her off the toilet paper balls because that, you know, it's problematic. Toilet paper, you know, gets expensive and it's all over the place. So then she was doing it with plastic packets. She was taking plastic packets and shredding it and then making. We've now eventually settled on wool. So we buy her wool and she sits there and all day long she makes these little tiny balls. Her pockets are full of little tiny balls of wool. She carries bags. She calls it her bollocky bag. She's got her little bollocky bag that's full of that. She's also got her dolls. So, you know, I mean, she's 30, but she loves her dolls. They play some really interesting games sometimes. Really interesting. So she has her dolls. So she has some really unusual idiosyncrasies that some of my boys have got their idiosyncrasies. You know, my boys have got some of their own idiosyncrasies, but hers are a little more unusual. So she sits and does paperwork. She will write things out, page after page after page after page of writing things. So there are those kinds of unusual things that also make it difficult for when they become adults, you know, to find to let them stay at someone's house or to find a carer who understands that and can work with that, or even to, you know, that's where you need facilities that can help with that. Because even if Takara was to go into a mainstream work environment where they were friendlier to people with intellectual disability, that sort of thing would become highly, highly problematic. And then there's part of me that goes, why would I want to put her through that? So why would I want to go and fight for, you know, inclusion in the workplace when the workplace is never going to be fully equipped to manage this sort of thing? She's never going to probably stop doing that. You can threaten, you can be kind, you can speak nicely, you can try everything. Takara is going to make, she calls them wormies. Takara is going to make wormies.
That's her thing.
Yeah. Fortunately, at Hodnet House, you know, she can make her wormies. They understand it. They've got certain rules. Put it away at the end of the day. But yeah, so there is that side of the coin that's a little different, I think, to having you know,
And that's, I
people.
think, a constant battle to decide. Like you said, you can fight and campaign to have her included in life outside, but it might be more disruptive or even traumatizing to her to be there. So she's
Yeah.
safer, secure in an environment where everything is known to her and she's accommodated with her little quirks and things.
And you know what? She's enjoying life. I mean, why are we alive? Well, surely we're alive to, we're alive to enjoy life.
Yes,
Um, we did send her on a work readiness program, and as part of that work readiness program, they have the ability to go into different companies and try different things. They try administration. That wasn't really her favorite. She loves work in the kitchen, so that she quite enjoyed. But and she did a bit of work in an organic garden. She did some packing at these large pharmaceutical companies and that sort of thing. But as a parent with Takara, I would not be pushing to try to get her into some sort of a job where she's going every day. She's doing repeated tasks, because generally that is the sort of thing. And maybe a kitchen, she might possibly enjoy a kitchen. But I think for her, the way that life is at the moment really does work. As you say, managing her idiosyncrasies, she's enjoying herself, she's stimulated, and fortunately she's got parents who can sustain that. I
yes,
think that the challenge is often when you are a parent who possibly financially can't,
won't do that.
can't sustain that.
Mm.
Yeah.
Candida, how do you do vacations? Does that affect her? Can
No,
she go to different
we just
environments comfortably?
chuck her in and off we go. But where it does become challenging, so she is fairly overweight, and her feet are so some people with Down syndrome tend to struggle a little with their feet. She has very unusually shaped feet, and they are very flat. So she struggles with long walking. If we're going hiking, etc., it's going to be a very long and very challenging 2 or 3 hours, because she is slower. I think also because she's a little, a little overweight. So I think that slows her down. It's difficult also to get her to drop the weight. I think her metabolism is a little slow. Again, it could well have been from those high doses of cortisone. And she loves food. She will steal food and sneak it off into her bedroom, I guess, like all of us do when we, when we're snacking and whatever. But if there's a lot of walking required, it is challenging. It's not easy to take her on long walks. We're hoping to take her to Italy, because we did say when she turned 30 we would go to Italy. My dad is from Italy, and so we would have to plan it very carefully. We would have to consider, how do we get from a point A to point B? How do we get onto trains? She's very afraid of heights and stepping up over heights. So even getting onto a train, we'd have to think about, how do we do that? How do we get her up into the aeroplane? Because she's probably will find going up the stairs of an aeroplane quite scary. She's done it when she was younger. And she's managed fairly okay, but it hasn't been a massive Boeing that's. So there are those sorts of things, more to do with height and long distance walking. But aside from that, we're able to pop her in and, we go off and we do our thing. So, yeah.
Lovely. So tell me, how does it feel as a parent to have children who are, like you said, at university and launching into careers and probably going to leave the nest soon? And you have a child who will probably never leave the nest, who will be with you and your responsibility forever, whereas your other children will probably become independent and not be reliant on you so much anymore.
Yeah. It's kind of, there's almost a few parts to that. It's quite a complex question. On the one side, there's always an anxiety of, if we die before her. Look, I had her very young. I do know in the past people with Down syndrome had a lower life expectancy. I do think that that's changed somewhat with modern medicine and the sort of care that's now available to people with disability. She was fortunate in that she didn't have any other conditions. A lot of them can have heart conditions and, various other health factors. So fortunately, she didn't have any of those. But I do worry about what happens once we pass on. Because I wouldn't want my boys to feel that they have to now take her in and to take care of her. So one does need to do things like, have a proper a trust in place so that, when you do pass away, that money is put into a trust that can take care of her for the rest of her life. Because, a SASSA stipend of 1,500 Rand a month is not going to look after your child. And there are so few facilities available that are state run, it's really a dire situation in the country. So on the one side, there's that, just a really practical thing around how she will survive and live. There's another part of me that feels sad, as we said earlier, because I sort of think, she'll never really have her own place and, have a boyfriend that comes and goes and be able to just go off and do her own thing. There are many Down syndrome people who can do that, but she isn't necessarily, she isn't necessarily that sort of person. So there's a little bit of sadness. And then there's also a part of me that goes, I'm not really ever going to be lonely. I'm gonna always have a cat, and I'm always gonna have my kid. So if God forbid something were to happen to my husband, I've got great company, because she really is good company. She's a good laugh. She has a wicked sense of humor. She's also, she can be grumpy and she can be quite feisty and cheeky, as I said. That's often where we clash. But generally speaking, she's sit in her bedroom and do her thing and enjoy her music and writing her, doing her paperwork, as she calls it, writing page after page and doing her wormies. So there's another part that thinks, I'm actually really fortunate. I don't think I'm never going to have empty nest. I'm always going to have one of them stay here with me. I'll live with the wormies, but I'm going to have good company. So
I absolutely love how well you illustrate the sad things about it and the happy things about it, the good and the bad. You find a balance in it all the time. It's inspiring. And I was wondering, as I'm listening to you, that you mentioned right in the beginning that your daughter's birth was like a death to you in some ways. And as she's grown up, have you also experienced a sense of loss or grieving because things are different? You mentioned that she had a 21st birthday, but she might probably never have a wedding, or she might probably never have a child, and things like that. Is there loss and grief around those things for you too?
Very occasionally, I sort of think to myself, wow, I wonder what she would look like if she didn't have Down syndrome. Because she's actually pretty. She's a pretty girl. So I kind of think like, if she didn't have Down syndrome, I wonder if she, would she have been taller? Would she still be, because she's very short. I don't even think she's 5 foot. She's really short. And she struggles with her weight. So I do often think of that sort of thing. But I think to some level, I've probably made peace with some of that. And also, we had things like, they would often do dances at her school when she was still at school. So they had almost, I suppose, the equivalent of a matric dance. I suppose, not something that goes through my mind a lot, but now that I'm kind of thinking of it, I do think sometimes I think, gosh, it would be lovely for her to have a partner, like you would go out with your son and his girlfriend, or your son and his boyfriend, or whatever his choice is, you'd go and with their partner and do something. Whereas with her, we're probably going to stay doing, younger things and not always experience that adultness. But it's not, it hasn't, I think I let go of a lot of the things like having a grandchild with her, etc., when she was still quite young. Yeah.
And I think one has a lifetime to adjust to the reality of it. So probably it's something that you work through as you're going on, I imagine.
Yeah.
And so I often wonder if thinking about the things that she might miss, like you mentioned, having a partner, the feeling of being in love with someone, falling in love with someone, having that romance and all those sort of things that we all take for granted and think it's going to happen to us, might not happen to everybody.
Yeah.
Yeah.
She has, I mean, she does like boys. I think she would love to have a boyfriend. And she often will tell me, she's got 23 boyfriends, and then she gives me a whole list of all these boyfriends. They're often actors and actresses, etc. What I have noticed, which is quite challenging, is that she can be a little, I suppose if she's an average age of around 6 or 7, sort of I suppose emotionally, etc. It's what we would what I might term sort of, behaving in a silly way. So being a bit inappropriate and getting quite carried away, because she can get very carried away when she likes a boy. So that is a little more tricky, and some facilities allow their adults, participants or delegates or whatever they refer to them as, the people that are there to pursue relationships. And then others don't. Others try to discourage it as much as possible. I'm personally of the view that relationships with other people are part of human nature. The fact that you have an intellectual disability doesn't mean that you don't want physical affection, and that you don't want, to have someone that you are romantically involved with. So that is still a little bit of a tricky one. Yeah, and just managing her behavior, because she plays out. So she's quite feisty if they say, like, you two can't be dancing like that together, because everybody's dancing, and then of course they dance a little bit too close, and then they hug each other, and then she gets really upset about that. So that's now proving to be a little bit of a challenge. So we try to distract.
Talk about managing her behavior, and I want to come from the point of counseling and work therapy, because I work with people with their traumatic experiences. How did you help her, teach her to regulate herself when she's triggered or overwhelmed? Is it different for her than with other children? Because that's something we need to teach them from a young age.
Yeah. And what I only sort of realized I guess, in growing up and maturing is I can become easily triggered. So I don't think I was always the best example to her of not losing it. And I'm impatient. I had a demanding job, and I was busy, and it took me many years, almost, I guess, to forgive myself for not being the ideal parent to her. But again, I've realized, you do the best you can with what you've got. And also my recommendation would be for anyone with a person, who has a person with disability, is to get the professional support to help yourself help them. Because I didn't do that until much later. And then and I think in addition to just her being intellectually disabled, we thought this petulant behavior was stubbornness and bad behavior. And in actual fact, it was neurochemical. It was a chemical issue. Since she's been on the stabilization medication, the mood stabilization, that has really helped her. We did, though, at a phase, actually take her to see a counselor and a social worker who would work with her and help her to understand that robot system, stop, think, act. But she can be very much more triggered, obviously, if she's around somebody who themselves is triggered. And so very often our clashes were around that. You've got 3 kids, you've got a demanding job, you're in a rush. Then you've got this one person refusing to go now because they want to finish their paperwork. And I'm just, I can't, literally don't have the mental and emotional capacity for it. So, my losing it was just not a helpful thing. We've managed to find our way, And again, through getting support with helping her, and then
Mm,
me working on, doesn't always have to be so dramatic.
mm,
You know, that has been helpful. At the school that she used to go to, I think also that she doesn't respond well to tough, being too tough or too aggressive or to what she
mm,
perceives as being unfair. If one handles her with kindness and compassion and fairness and love, she's much better able to manage herself.
mm,
It's easy to say when you don't have a group of 20 or 25 kids, all with intellectual
mm,
disability, that you're trying to manage. So it's not even a criticism around the school. It just is, I get it. So
mm,
she did play up quite a lot. And with certain teachers, she played up more. And
mhm,
that then became difficult. So when she's in that overwhelmed situation, it's really difficult for her to kind of get herself back to equilibrium,
mm.
particularly if the authority or power figure isn't themselves centered.
Yes. Mm,
It takes a lot. Where she is now, they have a very, very different approach. It's smaller, it's more contained. So there's maybe 6 or 7 to 8 maximum people in a group
mhm,
that works with a dedicated helper. So the system is much more focused on containment, you know, keeping the environment good. And she's been amazing. She's been
mm.
amazing in that space, and also with finding the right medication. But it came a little bit later on, that being able to help her to get
Mm.
herself back into a space of equilibrium. Yeah,
And
that's been very challenging
yeah,
for us.
and regulating ourselves is something everybody is challenged with our entire lives. It's something we constantly need to learn how to do, because new
Yeah,
things trigger us and we get upset. It's not something that any one of us get right or are perfect at. I was just
yeah,
curious for her.
yeah, yeah.
Well, Candida, this is such a great conversation. I'm so grateful that you've been comfortable to share this with us. I really,
Pleasure.
really appreciate it. And I know this is going to inspire everybody who listens and watches this video. I want to ask, you mentioned earlier as advice for people to get help for themselves, for parents to get help and support so that they can learn how to parent a child with such a disability. What else would you say to parents? What golden piece of advice can you give parents who find themselves in a similar situation?
Yeah, you know, I think first and foremost with any child or animal, if you show them love, whether the child is language proficient or not, we sense that at a soul level. So,
Mm,
you know, the most important thing is to love that human being. I remember many years back when Takara was just born, I met Domitella Hines, who was the woman who started Little Eden,
mhm,
where she takes very, 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 you know, severely disabled people. And she said to me in Italian, she was an Italian woman, she said to me, sono le parafulmine del mondo. She said to me, they are the lightning conductors of the world. And
mhm,
she comes from a Catholic background. So her belief was that every good deed that you do for these people is the equivalent of doing it for the Christ child. So it's the equivalent of doing it for God. You do it because they can't give you anything back,
mm,
you know. And I
mhm,
think sometimes it's easy to see the disability or to see what they don't have. But the thing is to remember that there's a soul there. What
mm,
have they got? What is that specialness that they've all got, every single one of them? And to love that thing, you know, absolutely unconditionally. I also think that it's about seeking out what is their ceiling. Don't create a ceiling for them.
mhm,
Rather work with them until they naturally find a point where, okay, this is now. But to
mm,
make the assumption they can't do it because, or oh, shame, you know, let me help, I don't think is helpful for people with disability at all. And they
mm.
don't need rescuing. They need support to live the best possible life
Yes.
that they can live.
Yeah.
So I think those two things would be crucial. Boundaries are also important for them. and then getting the right help. You need a network, you need a support system, you need places for reprieve. If you need to go away with your partner, you need somewhere safe where they can go, because you need the time out.
Yes.
You can't be 24/7 with this person and let it take over your life. So you also have to take care of you in that process of parenting them in the best possible way.
Sure, that's very valuable. A lot of stuff there that you said that I think is really valuable. Take care of yourself in all of this. And I love what you said about not giving them a ceiling and allowing them to just go as far as they can, which is sometimes quite surprising.
Takara swam the mid-mile many times.
Really?
I
Isn't
have
that
never even done
fantastic?
it. She's done it
Wow,
many times.
fascinating. So
Yeah.
she must enjoy water then.
Yeah, she does.
Unbelievable.
Yeah.
You see, that's a perfect example of how, and when we started, I said society has norms within which we feel comfortable, and look what she's done. Absolutely incredible.
Yeah. Thank you so much for chatting.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Really appreciate it. It's been an honor to talk to you.